So today what we're going to try and do is quickly review some previous week's perspectives on reading, and then we're going to move into some arguments and some questions about grammar and teaching English, and then we'll review another framework for thinking about reading. The 4 resources model, is that familiar? Okay, so in previous weeks, and in fact the last semester, you looked at Locke's model. We thought about the way in which this might give us some help and support for thinking about the teaching of reading. Originally, we put it up last semester for thinking about approaches to thinking about the teaching of writing. Now, of course, you have an assignment that you're preparing for. The first assignment looks at your teaching of writing. We're in the middle of 4 weeks where we think about the teaching of reading. Last semester, you looked at the teaching of writing. And so it's all, if you're sitting there, you might think that's just a big mess. But of course, our argument is that these things are intimately connected, and you've got to find ways to think about them in the context of the other. Whether or not a model like this grabs you. Last week we looked at McLaughlin and Reed's frames and framing, that idea, circumtextual, extratextual, intratextual and intertextual. We did a little bit of work in the lecture and in workshops trying to use this framework to develop activity ideas that might allow us to open up texts. This week we've asked you to come to the workshops with some activities based on the young adult fiction you've been reading, trying to work with these sorts of ideas as a way to begin to understand how they might assist you in your curriculum work. I want to pause briefly and just ask or I suppose ponder what it is that we're doing when we look at these frameworks, why it is that we might be presenting these to you. Next week we'll likely have another one. So you'll have 4 weeks, 3 frameworks for thinking about the teaching of reading, other frameworks we've looked at in semester 1. Why? Well, here's part of the reason. As a teaching team, we believe that so-called good English teaching is composed of at least a couple of elements. First, there's an imperative on English teachers, and we think a pleasure in thinking about our work conceptually. That if we simply believe that we can go through a career as an English teacher, just sort of taking the curriculum that someone else gives to us and implementing that, or turning up at school at 9:15 on a Monday and just grabbing the set of resources that the head of English has left out for you on the table for that class of year 8s you've got to teach, then we think that that's a really unpleasurable and a really debased way of thinking about our work as teachers. So we want to encourage you, as we have since the beginning of the year, to think conceptually about the work that we do. That might mean engaging with frameworks like the ones we've been talking about as a way to challenge our thinking about the sort of work we're doing, and to think beyond the everyday, beyond the immediate practical matters of getting the work done, which are very important, of course. But if we lose sight of the bigger questions that we might be wanting to explore, then I think we've lost our way. There's a second, of course. We need to think about our work pedagogically. Of course we do. You've got to take the ideas that you generate, the curriculum, the frameworks and ideas that we talk about here. You've got to bring all those together in your work as teachers. Depending on the context you're working in, depending on the kids you're working with, all of those things have to come together in a pedagogical sense. And so you have to develop the ability and, of course, the necessity to think about your work pedagogically. But we want you to think about them both conceptually and pedagogically. Good English teaching brings those things together. Okay, so that's just by way of introduction. Let's dive right into this. What is grammar? Has anyone got a definition that they'd like to offer us? What is grammar? The rules of language, the structure. Okay, anyone want to take that up, extend, challenge? No one else? Are we happy with that definition? No, yep.
I'd change rules to conventions.
Okay, so we're talking about conventions. Can you say a bit more about that? Conventions about?
Well, language is variable. It's never fully fixed. It changes, it evolves.
Let's have a look at a couple of perspectives here. So, traditional grammar, when we think of the phrase traditional grammar, I suppose it's the grammar that's often found in K-12 English textbooks. practical English handbooks and English usage guides. Such works typically provide a glossary of grammatical terms as the basis for rules of standard grammar, punctuation and usage. This sort of thing, you'd be familiar with these sorts of ideas. Traditional grammar embodies both a theory of sentence structure and purpose for grammar. So here's Wheeler writing in 1999 about traditional grammar. We're already, I think, suggesting that these sorts of definitions might not be that helpful for us. See if we can, let's do a parsing exercise. Can anyone parse this sentence for us? Do we know what a parsing exercise is? No? Anyone? Yeah? But you don't want to say. Because then I might have to do it. She says, I don't want to do it. So you've done it in the past. What were you doing when you were doing this? Yeah. What did it look like when you were doing this? Right. Mm. Okay. Okay. So that's exactly what a parsing exercise is. So we're looking at the sentence. This is a sentence, 2 words, and we're looking at the function that each of these words sort of plays in this particular sentence. So Hamish is a noun. Liz has decided that she's going to use that particular terminology. She might have used others. In fact, there may be other people here who might use other language. Noun is not the only word we might use to describe Hamish. Liz is saying that smiled is a verb. Okay. Is everyone okay with that sort of way of understanding this particular sentence? What if we added a little bit? Liz, does your parsing knowledge get you this far, or do you want to hand over to someone else? Someone else, she says, please. Anyone else? So what's happening here? We've added a little bit. So you have to say that again, sorry. A proposition. Mm-hmm. Well, you need a mic you can drop after that. That's pretty good going. Okay, so we could sort of engage in this exercise some bit, couldn't we? Could we add a little bit more? Hamish smiled is still there, but there's... Okay, so where's the independent clause? Okay. No, you're not at all. You're not at all. It's you're bringing your knowledge about language, or a particular way of thinking about language and describing it, to help explain this particular sentence. So you're talking about independent clauses, about prepositional phrases, and et cetera, et cetera. And those are helping you to understand how this language works here, the sentence works. So we might draw from that sort of understanding and think about how we might teach reading and writing, I suppose, couldn't we? But sometimes that's not an easy thing to do. So we might engage in these sorts of exercises as learning about language, or learning particular ways of thinking about language, but they're not the only way. Let's keep moving. So we can understand grammar to be this sort of activity in these sorts of languages, but there are other ways, as I've said. So these are some questions I think it's really useful to think about as you're entering the space of English teaching. Why is the teaching grammar controversial? So you folks probably know that there's people who describe themselves as grammar Nazis, and they walk around with big marker pens and sort of put punctuation into shop signs because they can't handle driving past a shop that has a greengrocer's comma or something like that. So grammar is really controversial. In fact, it becomes quite it almost functions as an empty canvas, if you like, upon which people often put a whole bunch of fears and anxieties about other sorts of things, about the degradation of language, or young people and their sort of understanding and behaviours and all these sorts of things. Let's see if I can identify some of the positions. Here they are. Since writing involves the manipulation of language, the knowledge about language is necessary for its manipulation. Therefore, students need grammar. Are you familiar with that argument? Yeah, or that kind of thing? You might not have to agree, but anyway, knowledge of grammar didn't do him any harm. In fact, I benefited from the discipline that was necessary for its mastery. In fact, I was whipped every day at school. Learn your grammar exercises. There's a connection here between the learning of grammar sometimes and this idea of discipline. It's been well recorded and written about. Here's another reason. All texts set out to manipulate readers in certain ways. This manipulation is managed by the deployment of a range of linguistic and textual features. An explicit knowledge of these features how these features function is required as readers, if readers are to develop the critical ability to bring the modus operandi of its manipulation to consciousness. What do you make of that reason? Is this reasonable? Texts function in a particular way, and they're undergirded by a set of conventions and practices, as we've talked about. To be able to understand how that text works, you've got to understand those conventions. My argument would be that all texts are non-neutral. They always have some design on us, whether that's to engage us in pleasure or in action or whatever. And so being able to understand how those texts work, I think is pretty useful. To what extent, to what level, what language, all of those questions should be up for grabs. And they are actually the terrain which with English teachers should be able to work. Okay, we'll develop this argument as we go a bit further. Okay, what about this one? Can we parse this? So it's not a sentence. Can you parse a picture? Did you ever do that, Liz, at school? No. So how would you do that? Do we have a language for talking about the conventions that underlie this form of communication? We've just talked about grammar as a set of conventions, something that shapes or that constructs texts and allows us to understand and to read them in a particular way. Could we say the same thing about visual texts? Do they have a set of conventions that underlie their production or their reading? So how would you do that? Ah, okay. Something, danger or attention or warning or some sort of heightened message. If it was green, that would be quite interesting, wouldn't it? Yeah, welcoming. Welcome to this area. But it's red. Okay, so all right, that's interesting. So I think that's an interesting way to start to think about this. What else might we make of this image? What conventions underlie its intended communication? Okay, so the shape of the sign? Okay, so the shape of the sign says something to us. It's some sort of warning signal. Okay, what if it was round? Would it be different, do you think? Hang on a sec. Is this like two UK people right here next to each other? Okay.
I think the round one's normally the speed one.
Our version of the yellow diamonds, so we don't have those for animals. Has anyone seen those for animals anywhere else in Australia?
No, they're yellow.
It's always yellow.
Because we sell them in the UK because we can bring them off them. They've got kangaroo bit on the side.
Yeah, okay, good. And so we're already getting a sense again that these conventions are socially and culturally dependent. So the UK, we're going to have a slightly different set of conventions. Can we offer any other conventions that underlie this communication here? Does the context help at all? Anything else? Anything else that helps with this image? So we actually can't decide, I think, it seems to me, about the sign itself without thinking about the context. That helps. So we might be able to argue that it's possible to parse an image. That's interesting. Here's some that we found in Greece just on a recent trip. We were in Greece in June, July with our research team. And here's one we were seeing all over the place. This one with an exclamation mark. And this one was fun too. Don't know whether that means you must be in a tractor to go here, or watch out for the tractors, or we just like tractors in this neighbourhood. This is tractor parking. Anyway, so Locke from the reading this week, if you've had a look at that, talks about grammar or convention in quite a different way. He uses language like symbol and icon, index, composition, layout, border, font, italic, plain, and so on and so forth. He says that this is a set of language that might enable us to think about grammar more expansively. So we might be thinking really about alternative approaches to grammar here. Here's Michael Halliday in 1985, so not very recently, a long time ago. Michael Halliday was a linguist, very well-known UK-Australian linguist. Talks about grammar goes beyond the formal rules of linguistic correctness. It's a means of representing patterns of experience. That's a very interesting phrase if we're thinking about conventions. It's a means of representing patterns of experience. It enables human beings to build a mental picture of reality, to make sense of their experience of what goes around them and inside them. This position is quite unradical for linguists. Michael Halliday's writing this in 1985. But often, for some reason, in schools, we insist upon a notion of grammar that's quite traditional and quite formulaic and quite often about correctness. Okay? But really, we're able to think of grammar in quite more open ways. So Chris and Van Leeuwen, in a very interesting book that you might want to have a look at called Reading Images, call grammar a set of elements and conventions that underlie a culturally specific form of communication, which is really the definition that we sort of arrived at earlier on in the lecture today. A set of elements and conventions that underlie a culturally specific form of communication. Okay, so in their book, Reading Images, that's what the most up-to-date version of the book looks like. It's very interesting if you're into sort of media studies or visual stuff. They move from words, sentences and paragraphs to things like colour, layout and composition. And they talk about the connections between verbal and visual language in this book. They argue that not all visual language or communication is the same, but it can work differently and has different grammars even within a visual way of thinking about grammar. So not just a visual grammar, but visual grammars. And that definition again, a set of elements and conventions that underlie a culturally specific form of communication. So Knapp and Watkins talk about grammar as no longer a set of inflexible rules about correct usage. In fact, modern grammars are less concerned with prescribing correct English than describing the way people use English and other languages in their daily life. So a move from prescription to function is the key one here. It's quite challenging as English teachers to think about what that might mean in our classrooms though. What might these sort of ideas mean for thinking about grammar in the classroom? Well, Mark Howie, a colleague of ours who works in New South Wales, he talks about the fact that it becomes then problematic to make grammar, or perhaps one kind of grammar, the focus of whole class instruction. Okay? And so Mark, in some of his writing, tries to develop ways of thinking about grammar and teaching grammar that's not based in giving everyone in the class a set of exercises they can work through from a grammar textbook. Right? He sees this as really problematic. In fact, a lot of English teachers would. That really teaching grammar like that in a decontextualised way, where you're just looking at a textbook, is not really the most effective way to do that. Okay? Terry Locke says there's more evidence for the usefulness of a metalanguage, i.e. grammar, in responding to texts than in the production of them. Okay? Just get your head around that for a second. So there's been lots of evidence, lots of research that's looked at whether grammar helps people, and particularly young kids, improve their writing. And a lot of that research says actually it's not that helpful, or depending on the way it's taught and integrated into kids' writing experiences, it often is not that useful. So Terry says there's more usefulness for grammar in responding to text. So when we talk about texts and we respond to them, we try to understand them, then clearly a metalanguage for helping us understand how language works helps us respond and talk about how language works. So grammar helps a lot in helping us think about and talk about language and text, but not so much in the production. However, as producers of text, we're also potentially responders to and reflectors on the text we produce. In the latter metacognitive role, I believe a knowledge of meta-language is useful. So when we're thinking about our own texts, crafting them, editing them, clearly a meta-language or knowledge about language or some kinds of grammars can be useful. So we get to a point when we're pursuing this sort of argument where we can propose an alternative rhetorical way of thinking about grammar. Now, rhetoric here is simply a way to signal this idea of use or function, okay? That language has particular effects in the world, and when we understand those effects and how those are created, we can do things with it, we can change that. So most of the time when we think of grammar, we think of stuff at the word level, don't we? Figures of speech, figures of sound, informal, literal, figurative, concrete, abstract, rhyme, redundant, synonym, antonym, word class. Actually, in fact, a lot of the time we just think of word class when we think of grammars. We're at the word level and we're identifying nouns, verbs, adjectives, various clauses and what have you. We forget that actually the word level language we might use and bring to bear on text is quite expansive. We might then think about, well, how does grammar work at the sentence level? Syntax, sentence types, phrase. We've already looked at phrases and clauses a little bit. That language has come up. Rhythm, metre, dialogue, indirect and reported speech, punctuation, modality, focus, theme, rhyme, just to give you some examples. So when we're thinking about grammar or knowledge about language at the sentence level, then other dimensions of a text come into view, okay? That's the idea here. And again, at the level of text itself. Have you ever thought of things like plot, form, layout as being sort of grammatical in this sense? Maybe not. But when we think of grammar as a set of elements and conventions that underlie a culturally specific form of communication, we might in fact think of these notions as grammatical if we move beyond grammar at the word level. And of course, text in relation to social context, cultural context, the context of situation, discourse, genre, story, audience, intention, purpose, the function of text. These can also be seen within a broader alternative rhetorical structure of grammar. Any questions? Any thoughts? Any insights? Anything you're wondering about? Go. Craft? Did I? What's that got to do with what we're talking about? So when I use a bit arty, bit artsy fartsy even, right? When I use the word craft, I suppose I'm thinking about language or the production of texts as an exercise where we're bringing together materials through which we want to provide some kind of, or construct some text or make some communication to somebody. And so when I think of the task of writing as that, I'm thinking of a craftsperson being really skilled at doing that and understanding the tools and conventions and materials that they might be using to craft a piece of rhetoric or a piece of communication in a way that it has its effect, it has the effect that they might want it to. And so a craftsperson needs to be familiar with all those things. I think in the same way a writer can improve their craft by understanding these sorts of elements as well. Does that make any sense? Yep. Okay. So we're not saying grammar's bad. What we are saying is grammar is probably not only what you originally might have thought it was, or the sort of grammar that takes place in schools. We might reasonably and quite usefully expand our sense of what grammar is and about what it might mean for our work in the classroom. That should be the question you should be asking. So what? We might have this perspective on grammar. What does that allow us to do in classrooms? Okay, so partly to answer that question, let's have a look at this model, 4 resources. So this model was developed by Allan, Luke and Peter Freebody in the 90s. And in the same way that we've just talked about grammar moving from prescription to function, this model was a move away from what is the best way to teach reading to what kinds of reading practices should schools value, encourage and teach. So it's about use, about what do readers do and how do we understand that better so we can encourage young people to do those things better. It posits 4 necessary but not sufficient roles of a reader in Luke and Freebody's terms in a postmodern text-based culture. It continues to develop as people use it, so like all models, they don't stay the same. And it moves from grammar being an end in itself to being something in the service of broader practices like reading, writing and meaning making. Okay, so here it is. It's on your handout there. And I've given you a set of questions that sort of work with each element of the framework to help to tease out the sorts of questions you might be asking if you're thinking about that role, and indeed using that role to think about the sort of activities you might be doing in classrooms with kids. Let's have a look at code breaker. So when we're operating in the role of code breaker, students, or all of us, we're asking, how do I decode the text? Letters, words, sentences, genres, subgenres, text type, grammar traditions, decoding conventions, etc. So the parsing exercise we did with the visual text, initially we were operating as code breakers. We were trying to work out what on earth that was doing, what conventions governed or shaped its construction and its use. So code breaking, how do we decode the text? Is there more than one code? Or, if you like, more than one semiotic system or sign system? Is it oral, gestural, linguistic, spatial or visual, for example? What patterns and conventions, what are the patterns and conventions in this code? So let's have a look at some really quick examples. We don't have a lot of time. A political clash has led to death and injury. Can we break this code? What are the codes and conventions operating here? Can we bring any of our knowledge about language to bear on a text like this? How do we explain? You're wanting to say something. Go, do it. No?
I've already read the second one, but they basically just kind of summarize it, like make it seem quite neutral.
Mm-hmm.
They don't give you any information about what political clash happened, so you don't really know. And it just says led to death and injury, so you don't know how.
Okay. So is there a language a technical language that anyone has at their disposal that can help us understand what's just been said? So this text does something so that there's no what involved at the moment. Something's missing. Certainly context is missing. Agency. Who's got the agency? It's sort of around somewhere. It's a political clash. Don't know what that is, right? So we see these sorts of texts in headlines all the time, right? This is from the Rhodesia Herald in 1975. What about this one? Rhodesia's white supremacist police opened fire and killed 13 unarmed Africans. What's the difference here? Right. So it's ascribing agency to who? Rhodesia's white supremacist police. So we've got two. This is from the Tanzanian Daily News. Wouldn't surprise you, I don't. So this is the same country, in case you didn't know. Rhodesia was what Tanzania was called up until its independence. And Zimbabwe, sorry. So here we've got two headlines that try and describe the news, but we might take a little bit of time and think about how conventions, how grammars are being used here to, in the first case, what might be the intention there? Okay, so when we're operating in this sort of way, when we're trying to understand the codes that or the conventions that allow language to be used in this way, we're actually doing grammatical work, right? We're operating as code breakers. Now, there's lots of material in the curriculum to help us to do this sort of work. So here's a couple of content descriptors from the language strand. The sub-strand is text structure and organisation. That pushes teachers or encourages teachers to do this sort of work. Understand and explain how the text structures of language and language features of text become more complex in informative and persuasive texts, and identify underlying structures, such as taxonomies, cause and effect, and extended metaphors. So there's lots of material in the curriculum that encourages us to work with knowledge about language. We don't have time to dwell on this at the moment. But we also might look at other things, newspapers. There's codes and conventions that underlie this form of communication too. Of course, newspapers are quite different these days, and being able to read them and understand them is breaking code, if you like. It requires us to think about codes and conventions as readers. So this 4-resource model, here's another one. Right. So there's an imperative here for teachers to think about grammar and how these things shape our work. The curriculum has that in there. And we can work with a whole range of texts to do this sort of work. We can even work with texts such as this one. Does anyone know what this text is? Can anyone read it? It's got to be read in a particular way, in the way the cursor's moving here. This way, this way, this way, like this. Okay? And then on the next page, you obviously start here and move the same way.
The Norseger example here is a great example of the way that different text types operate on different codes and conventions, and we might say different grammars. So the text example here is obviously a mixture of visual and written modes, and both those different modes have their own conventions, and the mixture of those here does create a disorienting experience if you're not familiar with this kind of text, if you're unfamiliar with the codes that it operates on. So to take the reading path example, if you've learned to read from left to right, then encountering text like this from a different cultural context means that you tend to be unfamiliar with the way that that text is read. Now that is because, of course, you are unfamiliar with the particular codes and conventions that this particular text works with, and that underlie its particular formation and construction. So essentially we're talking about here multi-modes, and the way in which different modes have separate and specific grammars. To use Cress's definition again, a set of elements and conventions that underlie a culturally specific form of communication. Now, in discussing the four resources model, we've been mostly emphasising up to this point the operating in the role of code breaker. Now, there are three other elements to the framework as well. As you can see, text participant, text user, and text analyst. And just in terms of wrapping up the lecture, we'll talk briefly about each of these, but not in a lot of detail, so I'd encourage you to chase up these particular roles in your own reading, and we'll revisit those in future workshops and lectures. So first, text participant. You can see that we've given you a list of questions there that help you to get a stronger sense of the kinds of practices that are being engaged when you're operating in the role of text participant. So questions about prior knowledge and experiences influencing the meaning making of the text. Think about the possibilities for different kinds of meanings and the tensions that might exist there. The way in which the text itself coheres and is sequenced, and ways in which readers come to understand those sorts of connections. That third one, text user, just briefly, obviously focuses on what use might be derived or made from a text, whether that's during the reading process or subsequent to the reading process. What is the purpose of the text, and what is the purpose of the reader in using or reading the text? How are those uses shaped by the text and its composition? What should we be doing with the text? What does the text want us to do with it? What do we do with the text that it doesn't want us to do? That's a useful question as well. And what options and alternatives exist through the reading or after the reading? So this third frame or role, text user, really puts emphasis on active readings, or in thinking about what actions might be encouraged or performed with texts. And the final role, text analyst or critic, really is a way of engaging with notions of critical literacy, if you like. So to think about that as a connection here is a useful one. So when we're operating with this text analyst or text critic role, we're asking questions about what kind of person with what interests and values produced the text, what aspects of culture, politics, society, religion, gender, etc., class were dominant in the production or construction of that text. How does that text seek to position readers, and whose interests are represented in the text or served by the text itself, and what voices perhaps are absent from that text, and what are the implications for that? So these four roles, just want to emphasise that we're not talking about discrete roles here. The model certainly encourages thinking about the connection between those roles, and an acknowledgement that active reading always really involves a number of these roles working in collaboration or conjunction with each other. So in terms of using this framework in thinking about our teaching of reading, it's more productive really to think about the way in which these roles might be working in concert, not necessarily isolated and cut up or clearly neatly bounded. So in just concluding then, a couple of comments about where we've arrived. So what, if you like? We've looked at a number of useful ideas in the lecture. We've talked about the importance of reframing our sense of what grammar is, from a focus on correctness to a focus on use, on how people actually use language and grammatical frameworks or meta-language that allows us to understand how language is being used in those situations. So Terry Locke has, I think, some useful perspectives in helping us understand perhaps the so what here. So Terry argues that the role of English or literacy teachers really is to make our students aware that context-specific textual engagement is an inevitable facet of their social lives as human beings, and that different contexts have different rules for textual engagement. And as English teachers, as literacy teachers, we can really latch onto this and think, well, okay, if that context-specific textual engagement is an inevitable facet of young people's lives, then how can we help prepare them for that textual engagement so that they're active meaning makers, producers, users, and analysts in terms of the texts that they come across and that they use. So this also suggests that a framework like the 4 resources model can help with some of this work, particularly if we couple it with a meta-language to give it some extra grunt or power. So identifying that context-specific textual engagement and thinking about what aspects of those situations might we help our young people in our classes become more attuned to. So Terry talks about this as well, where he says that this rhetorical functional approach means teachers and students are freed from something like endless parsing exercises to then explore the rhetorical features of the texts that they're using in particular contexts. That might be the context of study, or it could be some other aspect of context. So he says in those sort of situations, then teachers are empowered to identify the language features that we think are going to be most useful for students in confronting the textual worlds and situations that they might be in. So that's all. We've got some references there so you can chase up some of these ideas, and we look forward to some further discussion. Thanks, folks.